All right, well, let's get started. There may be others that will be joining us. We have quite a large gathering right now. I'm very pleased to see. So let me start off by saying greetings to everyone. I'm Laurel Schneider, Chair of the Religious Studies Department here at Vanderbilt University. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this important and rather timely panel on religion in the 2020 election. Professor Adina McNichol, our wonderful and amazing assistant professor of Buddhist traditions of South Asia, dreamed up this event last year, and we're very happy to have it come to fruition. We're also grateful to the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities at Vanderbilt, under the direction of my friend Professor Holly Tucker, for supporting this really important event. Without them, we would have had a lot of difficulty making it happen. So thank you to them. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor McNichol, who will introduce each panelist and moderate the proceedings. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider. So welcome everybody. I'm so glad that we had such a good turnout and that you could all be here today. I'm so glad this was able to go on. Thank you to the Religious Studies Department and the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities for co-sponsoring such an important and, as Dr. Schneider said, timely event. And I want to thank especially everybody who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help us organize this event and then convert it online. Particularly, I want to shout out Mary Gray in the Robert Penn Warren Center, who is hosting this and quickly learned how to use the webinar function for Zoom just for us. But also, everybody else at the Robert Penn Warren Center and Emily Stewart, our administrator for religious studies, for working behind the scenes to help us out. And obviously, I want to give a big thank you to our panelists for taking the time to join us tonight during a very busy semester, as well as all of you for attending. So I'm first going to introduce our panelists before asking a series of questions on various themes that have been coming up in terms of religion and the election, including issues of race and ethnicity and coronavirus. Our panelists are going to respond to these and to each other based on their particular areas of expertise. And while the event itself is scheduled from 4 to 5:30, our panelists are available to stick around until 6 p.m. to answer questions from the audience. So feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom bar and ask questions as our conversation proceeds. And we're going to do our very best to keep an eye on the Q&A as we go and incorporate them into the conversation as much as possible. So that being said, I want to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So our first panelist is Dr. Natalie Avalos. Dr. Avalos is Assistant Professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She's an ethnographer of religion whose research and teaching focuses on Native American and Indigenous religions in diaspora, healing historical trauma, and decolonization. She's currently working on a book titled The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigeneities and Religious Refusal, which explores urban Indigenous and Tibetan refugee religious life. Our next panelist is Dr. Sophie Bjork James. Dr. Bjork James is Assistant Professor of Anthropology here at Vanderbilt University. Her research engages with the American religious right and the white nationalist movement, extending to issues of race and racism, reproductive politics, and environmental politics. She is co-editor of the recently published book, Beyond Populism, Angry Politics and the Twilight of Neoliberalism, and author of the forthcoming book, The Divine Institution, White Evangelicalism's Politics of the Family. Our next panelist is Dr. Allison Collis Green. Dr. Green is Associate Professor of American Religious History and Director of the Master of Theological Studies program at Emory University. Her research focuses on American religions as they relate to politics, wealth, and poverty, race and ethnicity, the environment, and the modern rural South. She's the author of the award-winning book, No Depression in Heaven, The Great Depression, the New Deal, and the Transformation of Religion in the Delta, which has suddenly become very relevant for our present conversation. She's currently working on a book about religion, race, and the land in the rural South. Our next panelist is Dr. Edward Curtis IV. Dr. Curtis is Millennium Chair of the Liberal Arts and Professor of Religious Studies at the Indiana University School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. His research and teaching focuses on Islam, African American religions, American religious history, and religion and race. He is a rather prolific writer who has written and co-authored, by my count this morning, 11 books on Islam in the United States. I don't know why it's not an even dozen, but his most recent book is titled Muslim American Politics and the Future of US Democracy. And last but definitely not least is Dr. Lerone Martin. Dr. Martin is the Director of American Culture Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where he is also Associate Professor at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. He is a historian of religion in the 20th century United States, with a particular interest in the intersection of religion and politics, including the relationship between American religious media and race, socioeconomics, gender, citizenship, and nationhood. He is the author of the award-winning book, Preaching on Wax, The Phonograph and the Making of Modern African-American Religion. He's currently writing a book on the relationship between the FBI and white evangelical conservatism, titled America's Bishop, J. Edgar Hoover and the Shaping of American Religion. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining me on what I'm sure is going to be a very exciting conversation. I've been looking forward to it for quite a while. So I want to begin with asking us to look back a little bit in history. And I want to ask you all, based on your areas of expertise and the particular ways you approach religion, religious history, how has religion intersected with previous elections? And what continuities and differences are we seeing play out in the 2020 election?
I'll jump in first and I'll be real brief here. I work on the Great Depression and the New Deal, but to this question, I just have to say religion has intersected with every United States election, and each time in a distinct way. I think what's telling now is that we are seeing ever more, especially over the last 50 years, the degree to which white evangelicalism is bound up with Republican Party politics, and the degree to which non-white, non-evangelical, and non-Christian Americans are able to mobilize and form coalitions that allow for collaboration across difference without demanding conformity. I'll say more in the later questions, but I'll just send that out as an opener.
Sure. I will add on to that since the late 1970s, white evangelicals have been voting pretty much as a bloc and represented a significant portion of the electorate. They still are representing around 25% of the electorate, even though their percentage of the actual population has been decreasing significantly due to changes in both racial demographics and religious demographics. And the kind of fear of that change is, I think, reshaping the relationship between white evangelicals and racial politics in ways that I'll speak about more later.
I will make a huge overgeneralization perhaps, but to say that religion, particularly the religion of state nationalism, civic religion, the belief that the United States is a God-ordained nation that is meant to spread white liberty around the world and in North America. I mean, that's been a key theme from the first contested election of 1800, Jefferson versus Adams, to our election. And the liberty that is seen as sort of God, as sort of divinely chosen, you didn't hear me wrong when I said that's almost always defined as white liberty, the liberty of white people. And I think that is right on the surface of this election as it was back in 1800.
So I'll just add from a Native context. My sense is that the last election in 2016, that was really the first time we saw Native sovereignty issues being agitated for and negotiated on a pretty national level. I think it brought Native sovereignty issues because that's when Standing Rock was happening. It brought these issues, which are essentially religious issues, because Native sovereignty is always tethered to land, stewardship of land. And if you understand yourself as a steward, it's because you understand yourself as a relative of land, as coextensive with land. And that's part of your larger worldview. And so those religious ideals have been at the forefront for Native people for centuries, but we really, as a US community, hadn't seen that level of agitation since the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee. So it had been over 40 years. And since that time, since 2016, land movements, sovereignty movements have been very salient and have been largely supported by non-Native people in the US.
You know, and I'll jump in and add to this question of continuity and change over time. You know, I really believe that a lot of commentators and scholars have argued that what we're seeing now with white evangelicals is somehow a departure from the white evangelical political behavior. And I really think that that's flat out wrong. I think that what we're seeing is a great deal of continuity with the modern white evangelical movement and their support of Donald Trump. I think for my own interest, white evangelical institutions were very supportive of J. Edgar Hoover, who we all know was not a white evangelical, but had questionable sexual ethics, at least in terms of from evangelical standpoint. He had questionable constitutional commitments, and he certainly did not express being born again, but yet he received a great deal of support from white evangelicals, writing over 10 essays for Christianity Today, and was considered a part of the evangelical movement. And then we see the same thing with Reagan. Reagan was not an evangelical by any standpoint. He preferred to consult astrologists as opposed to consulting clergy for his personal and professional direction, and so forth and so on. So what I see in terms of, I see a great deal of continuity today with white evangelical support for Donald Trump as opposed to a departure. And I think that's important for our conversation around religion and politics, because we see that both sides, we have both white evangelicals and those who are their opponents and critics who are saying that if we can just get rid of Donald Trump and get Donald Trump out of office, and then somehow white evangelicalism will go back to its core. I think what we're seeing with Donald Trump is sort of the core of white evangelicalism that's very, very evident, and the covers have been pulled back, the respectability has been pulled back, but the politics and the commitments to, as Brother Ed said, to a certain kind of Christian nationalism at all costs are still very present and will be present whether or not Donald Trump is reelected.
All right, so I think this is a good time to really dig into some of these, religious worldviews of, white evangelicals. So I wanted to ask about the 1776 Commission, which President Trump recently announced as a way to promote patriotic education and to develop a pro-American curriculum. And in establishing this commission, he positioned it against the 1619 Project, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and critical race studies. And in response to the rise of protests against the extrajudicial murder of Black people by the police, the Trump-Pence ticket has repeatedly maintained that structural racism is not real. So I was hoping that you could all speak to the way that religion and race can help us understand these events and these polarizing visions of American history.
I mean, I'll happily touch on that subject really briefly. I think that what's at stake, it seems to me, is, Professor McNichol, is, and I've learned a great deal of this from your colleague at Vanderbilt, Professor Wells Ogogame, and that is that what role are we really going to assign to slavery in the nation's history? And I think what we're seeing with the president's recent executive order, I think what we're seeing is a pushback against really accepting the fact that slavery is not just the economic foundation of America, but the very foundation of America's social organization, especially as it relates to its racial hierarchy. And I think President Trump's pushback against that is a pushback against what role are we going to understand about the role that slavery played, in shaping of the country. Now, I will say, and perhaps I'll get some pushback on this, but I will say that the anti-racism enterprise, I think, has done some great work. But I also think that when you're in America, we have to be careful about the role that capitalism plays in that. And by that, I mean the anti-racism enterprise is doing some great work, but it has to be careful that it's not completely taken over by market forces. There is now anti-racism physical education curriculum. I'm not quite sure what that means, right? But my only point of that is that market forces are even taking over the anti-racism enterprise, which in many ways is ironic because it only reinforces other types of racism, right, as it relates to capitalism. So I think we have to be careful when we start talking about the anti-racism enterprise. However, the fact remains that what we're seeing right now is a fight over the role that slavery will play in the history and memory. And I think that's what's key.
So just to follow the remarks of Dr. Martin, if we actually understand the arguments of the 1619 Project, we would understand 1776 as an insurrection against the possibility of slavery being outlawed by England. And so I think, he's quite right to say that not only was the inception of the country really catalyzed by this possibility, but that racial capitalism exists as the core of its ideology and its material reality, its material possibility, right? And so it necessitates the the illegal acquisition of native lands, the elimination of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of not only indigenous peoples, but also African diaspora peoples. And so really the irony of the 1776 project is that while it tries to hide these material realities, it actually just reinforces that they're at the center of its ideology.
Yeah, so, and what I would add to this really important discussion is that really there's always been these two narratives about the United States, right? So there's the reality of, it's been described that the United States was founded as a racial dictatorship, right? It was founded on genocide, slavery, deeply, deeply unethical practices by any standard. But at the same time, there's this dominant narrative, right, that puts that in a very Christian framework that, the United States is exceptional. It's the city on the hill, it's divine, it's inspired. And that narrative has become very much sacralized within the white evangelical tradition, but also many white Christian traditions. So that, there's been a kind of consolidation of white supremacy and theology connected to Christian nationalism that for many white Christians is the center of their identity. And so I feel like what's happening is we're having these demographic changes that are challenging the hegemony of that narrative. And so there's this defensive response to try to, push against the reality, which is, a history of incredible, inhumanity, right? In terms of, it's not a moral, the history of the United States is not a moral story. I mean, it's a moral story of injustice, not of divine inspiration. And so I think what we're seeing is this kind of attempt to maintain hegemony of that narrative, which also then is, allows for a lot of particularly white Christians to continue to see themselves as moral and not having to recognize the ways that they have benefited from these histories of white supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that question of narrative, the thing you can say for the 1776 Commission is it's a lot more honest response to the 1619 Project than the other favorite, which is let's just leave the past in the past, right? Like it's a response that says, no, I'm going to pick this past and not that past, right? And so I think it tells us a lot about how we understand who we are, right? As one of my favorite historians is the Haitian historian Michel Roth-Trio, and he wrote during the textbook wars in the 90s, he said, the ultimate mark of power, maybe its invisibility. The ultimate challenge, the exposition of its roots. Right, the 1619 Project is the exposition of its roots. Whatever the critiques are across the political spectrum, right? It is the exposition of the roots of power. And the 1776 Commission is a response to the exposition of the roots of power. And it does what good history should do. It raises questions about the narratives that dominate our public understanding, not what all of us believe, but our public understanding about a collective sense of identity where whiteness is in the middle, is at the center, is unmarked. And it raises questions about this hierarchical social order that 19th century white Southerners articulated most explicitly, but that remains implicit even for people for whom it isn't explicit, where whiteness and masculinity and Christianity are at the top, and again, are unmarked and are thus deserving of all the things, right? To bring in the capitalism part of it. That's who deserves the things. If we talk about deservingness, everybody else doesn't quite deserve the things. And so the 1619 Project, if it raises questions about this narrative, right, then it raises questions about what we all deserve, not just who we are, right? But it pokes at all those economic questions that Dr. Martin raised.
And I would just add, for those sort of wondering, well, where does religion fit into the 1619 versus 1776? And so one of the ways in which it fits in is, on the one hand, there is an evangelical and explicitly Christian theology about the United States as chosen territory, as a new Israel. And I mean evangelical in the old sense of evangelical, not in the new sense. I mean more Methodist 1700s So there is that. But we also have to remember that the Enlightenment tradition and the tradition of liberalism, which was a pro-market, pro-private property, manifested in a Jefferson who thought that, all that evangelical religion was pretty phooey. And yet, white supremacy was supported by two pillars. I mean, the Enlightenment tradition on the one hand, right, and a kind of Christian nationalism on the other hand. And so it didn't, both cohered in white supremacy. And so it's interesting that that white supremacy seems to be so strong that it can be in part because there are different kinds of religious ideas and ideologies that can support it. And one of the things that makes the assumption, the capture of human beings and the assumption of native lands possible is the idea that native people don't have a religion, they're savages, they don't use the land properly, they haven't cultivated it properly, they haven't gotten its true value out of it. And then, of course, the idea of the idea of that Black African people are either in need of salvation because they have, they're fetishists, who don't have proper religion, and so religion is an absolutely essential part of the development of white supremacy, whether we're talking about liberals or conservatives. Because remember, for Jefferson and those Enlightenment guys were just as they were scared crazy that religion was going to make everybody crazy. It's going to make everybody irrational. And so, right? And so only religion properly contained and properly channeled could possibly make white democracy possible. But one thing they all agreed with their evangelical friends was Black people and Native people, they didn't have a real religion.
So I'd like to follow up very briefly with what Dr. Curtis said. Thank you. Part of this initiative, the 1776 initiative, seems to be very invested also in reframing the narrative in terms of Indigenous dispossession. It's often totally disappeared, totally silenced, but also there was just a proclamation that was released by the White House over the weekend about Columbus Day, with, again, no mention of Indigenous people at all, but actually clearly paranoid statement that said it was radicals that were seeking to distort the true history of Columbus, and instead of learning from this history, sought to erase it. And that, to me, honestly reads as a very threatened response, as a response of a collection of people that clearly have no control over the narrative and know it, and are desperately seeking to regain control.
Yeah, so I think, so we have one question from the audience that I think ties really nicely into this conversation about, different visions of history and how they can change through education. So this question says, what role does religious literacy, meaning individuals understanding their own religion, understanding other people's religions, play in American politics? And do higher levels of religious literacy result in individuals becoming more progressive?
No, they don't. One of the great failures of the interfaith movement, for example, is to whitewash the occupation of Palestine, and one of the great. I mean, you're oftentimes, if you're pro-Palestinian, you can become, as I know from personal experience, persona non grata in the interfaith community, unless you accept the Zionist narrative and the takeover of Palestinian land. So you could be as progressive on everything from here to, it doesn't matter. But boy, if you start talking about Zionism, you're out of the community. So I know for certain on the issue of Palestine, and oftentimes that extends to Islam and Muslims. It's as long as Muslims and talk like Christian Democrats or Christian Republicans, Americans, it's fine. But boy, if you start talking about U.S. foreign policy in a way, and the surveillance, the incredible surveillance of Muslim Americans, and Guantanamo Bay, which remains open, but notice how Guantanamo is not an issue in this election, and Muslims are not an issue in this election in the way that they were 4 years ago, in a big way, right? But so I would. And there's quite a lot of literature, and I can share some of that more later if you want. But unfortunately, people who are, the 40% of Americans who are anti-Muslim are actually deeply knowledgeable, many of them, about Islam. They can quote from the Quran, they can quote from the Hadith. I mean, really, they know quite a lot about Islam. Knowledge, unfortunately, does not equal goodness. And so you can use it for ill or you can use it for good, but it can help, but it doesn't necessarily do so.
And there are kinds of knowledge too, right? I mean, the term religious literacy is one with many possible meanings, right? If you think of religious literacy and learning about religious literacy as learning about the way in which the category of religion is the invention of white Christians, right? Then you develop a different kind of religious literacy than if you can tick off all of the features of the things that white Christians have designated as religions, right? And so I think we have to know what we're talking about when we're talking about developing religious literacy, right? I grew up Southern Baptist, and it was okay to learn like ticking the boxes of other religions, but there were forms of religious literacy that were dangerous, right? That were threatening, to which we were not to have access because they might change us. And those forms of religious literacy were mostly the forms of religious literacy that required self-knowledge, right? That required knowing one's own tradition, knowing its history in a way that wasn't purely triumphalist, and then again, asking questions about it. So on the one hand, of course, I agree, knowledge does not equal goodness, but withholding knowledge can stand in the way of a lot of goodness, for lack of a better framing.
So I'd like to add that I could see religious literacy in two ways. And the way that I approach it is actually epistemological plurality. What exists outside of a white Christian epistemological framework. So, what I appreciate about what ethnic studies has done, especially in conversation with religious studies, is it's really sought to reclaim and recenter non-Western, non-white knowledges, and how those knowledges are actually coexisting with us. And so, when we're teaching about religious others, it's also really important to talk about the dynamics of power, that power knowledge is always operating generally in a colonial imperial context to tell you what can exist as legitimate knowledge and what cannot, and why not, and its legacy. So doing that whole genealogy, I think, helps disrupt some of the kind of domestication of that discourse that Dr. Curtis described.
And I want to add that Dr. Avalos just wrote a great article on this that I think if you find her on Twitter, did you tweet it out today, was it? Yeah, so I read it and it's really fantastic. So if you want to see her, write more about it, then I'd look it up. All right, if there's no other responses to that question, I think this might be a good time to move on to, I think, thinking about, immigration and national security in the way that, the government surveillance apparatus has created knowledge about different kinds of religious communities. So when I came up with this question, I was thinking particularly of Dr. Avalos, Dr. Curtis, and Dr. Martin, since their work engages with issues of colonization, law enforcement, national security, and surveillance. But obviously, anybody feel free to comment on this, because I know you all have good things to say about it. But we've recently seen, the Trump presidency being marked by, protests against different kinds of immigration policies, including Executive Order 13769, which became known as the Muslim ban, the proposed building of a border wall, the use of detention camps at the southern border, and as well as protests against bias and surveillance and policing of communities of color, which has, these are all things that have a much longer history than just this current presidency, this current election. So I was wondering if you, each of you from your own perspective, could situate this for us historically and speak to how these events speak to the broader history of settler colonialism, immigration restriction, surveillance, and religion in the United States.
Well, I'll jump in and I'll let my colleagues take it from here. So one point that I'll make is at least thinking about the construction of America's foreign law enforcement force, and most foremost federal law enforcement, and that's the FBI. And J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI from 1924 to 1972, the longest serving FBI director in American history, and perhaps the longest civil servant in American history at the federal level. J. Edgar Hoover had a particular understanding of America and American democracy, which he built upon an idea of Christian nationalism, that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that the only way America was going to prosper is if America continued to be a Christian nation. And for Hoover, a Christian nation was one in which abided by law and order, patriarchal family norms, and a certain understanding of racial hierarchy that had white Americans at the top. And so he created the modern FBI to be an image of that. So the FBI in American history, when the time Hoover took over in 1924, became exclusively an all-white male force, which was charged with policing the rest of the country. And he exclusively recruited white male Protestants and Catholics. And he engineered a religious culture within the FBI that was predicated upon his own understanding of Christianity. FBI agents had to sign a vow when they became a pledge, when they joined the Bureau, which included saying that they would be ministers and soldiers for America, to protect America against her enemies, to maintain America's Christian commitment and Christian democracy. So this is the FBI that we have in American history, and is all white male until Bobby Kennedy comes in and really pushes J. Edgar Hoover to finally start hiring people of color, primarily African-American men in 1962. Women do not join the FBI until 1973. So this is American law enforcement at the top level. And the ghost of J. Edgar Hoover in many ways is still within the FBI. It is still an overwhelmingly white and male force that is policing a largely diverse force in America. So I'll just stop there and let my colleagues take it from there, just to think about what role did a certain kind of religious nationalism play in formulating our federal law enforcement, and how are we seeing that play out today? And I think my colleagues can speak to that better than I can.
So I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for that contextualization. It's so fascinating to me because, I think about the crisis at the border, really the manufactured crisis at the border, and the ways in which we can really understand it as linked to not only the Mexican-American War of the middle 19th century, but essentially to Indian dispossession more generally, because of the way that Mexicans were racialized as mongrel native people. And so innately primitive, innately criminal, and a threat to what Steve Bannon has called really kind of an existential threat to like white Christendom, right? And so it's a manufactured crisis because we've actually had a negative immigration rate from Mexico for the last 10 years, meaning there's more people leaving the US than actually coming in. But one of the reasons why that discourse at the border and that, we have to protect our borders at all costs, it's really rooted in the same claims what Dr. Curtis has noted, this white Christian discourse that is essentially became articulated more clearly in Manifest Destiny at about the same time that the Mexican-American War was starting to build up, right? And so the Indian Wars really, they're described as happening through the 1800s, but they started in the 1600s and the 1700s. And those Indian Wars were simultaneously directed at what was then Spanish lands and then later Mexican lands. And so for settlers, the borderlands, or what is the frontier, is simultaneously the place where you can always go and acquire new lands illegally because you have the right, you have the God-given right to do so, but also the place that you continually have to patrol and surveil, because it's the potential place of insurrection. It's the potential place where Native people and quote unquote Mexican peoples might try and reclaim their lands, reclaim power. And we also have to think that in the last 10 years, even though there was a negative immigration rate, there was probably among Latinos the largest population growth rate. And so numbers went from, I want to say in 2010, 16% of the population now to 18%, with projections that Latinos would be 25% of the population by 2050, almost 30% by 2060. And Latinos is really a misnomer. Many of the folks that were coming across the border were indigenous peoples from southern Mexico and Central America. So what we're seeing is the re-indigenization of the US, and that's incredibly threatening.
And that history, Dr. Avalos, that you just described also merges with the history of Islam and Muslims in the Americas, because so to make clear, I mean, in my view, policing and war making are two different kinds of the same activity, which is the spreading, the assertion of white power over land and over people. Whether it is in North Africa, in the first two foreign wars of the United States against the so-called Barbary states. Remember, that's where, I mean, so many, the Marine sword, that's where we get the US Marine Corps sword. That's so many of our national symbols are from those very first, because these are, and again, there we have a situation where Jefferson was talking tough in the 1800s. It's so strange how things don't, tout ça change. The things don't change, whether we're talking about George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks or Thomas Jefferson in the campaign of 1800, when those Barbary pirates take prisoner American sailors because they refuse to let them go through their waters without actually getting a little taxation, right? That's what they were. And that turns into an assault on our liberty. What is our liberty? Our liberty is the liberty of white people to move, to invest, to use the land. And it's important to say that one of the first things that Ferdinand and Isabella did in the 1500s, and that the Spanish regime did, right, is to ban the importation of Muslim slaves to the Americas, in part because they were very concerned that Muslims might lead a revolt. So even this Islamophobia has been another pillar. This anti-indigenous, anti-Black, and anti-Muslim discourses have been part of white supremacy for a very, very long time. We can really situate them at the beginning of the quote unquote New World. And in my last book, that's what I explored, was the way in which anti-Muslim war making, both at home and abroad, is part and parcel, not just of a white evangelical culture, but of white liberalism. So that and liberals have often been as responsible as conservatives in war making abroad. Think about who declared all the wars, the US presidents in the 20th century. And one of the barometers of the assertion of white power throughout has always been the policing of Muslims at home, and starting with enslaved African-American Muslims, right? And the war making against Muslims abroad.
You know, I think this is one of the concerns that we've seen during the Trump administration, is that what my dear brother's talking about in terms of in a domestic sense is the inability or unwillingness to confront the rise of white nationalism in the US as it relates to terror attacks. Christopher Wray, who's the current FBI director, has testified before Congress and been very clear that the majority of their domestic intelligence concerns are coming from white nationalist groups, not from people of color, not from Islamic communities, but actually white nationalist groups. But yet it seems that the FBI and federal law enforcement, Department of Homeland Security, et cetera, they're behind when it comes to tracing these folks. Now, we all know other communities, they're 12 steps ahead oftentimes when it comes to concerns about terror attacks. Now, the recent situation we've seen in the news with the governor of Michigan, that certainly is something that was I would say, a good sign in terms of the FBI's ability to stop this attack against the governor of Michigan. But overall, the Bureau has still been very far behind on getting ahead of the rise of white nationalism, especially as it relates to violence. And I think some of these things that Brother Ed has just said as it relates to not just thinking about race, but also the kind of political commitments, whether one is conservative or liberal. A lot of this happened with James Comey, who, you know, would consider himself a liberal Protestant, right? James Comey was the FBI director. He's United Methodist, taught Sunday school, wrote a thesis on Niebuhr. His Twitter handle was Niebuhr, right? But a lot of these things happened underneath his watch. So I think Brother Ed is right, and we have to be really mindful and thoughtful about how these things are playing out and the narratives that are being spent, as you mentioned in your question, Professor McNichol, about the narratives that are being spent about certain groups of people and where that knowledge and epistemology derives from and comes from.
Yeah, and if I'm allowed to add things on my own panel, I would just add in terms of, you know, the history of Buddhism in the United States, you know, we see with Executive Order 9066, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, which began prior to Pearl Harbor, where state surveillance agencies, government surveillance agencies in the United States and in Canada started surveilling the Japanese American community and made lists of who is deemed you know, anti-American, and it wasn't just based on race, it was also based on religion. So who was number one on the list to be locked up in the event of War of Japan? It was Japanese American language teachers, Shinto priests, and Buddhists, and Buddhist leaders in particular. And so, you know, within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, government officials had already started rounding up Buddhist priests, some of whom were like still in their robes that they had been wearing to, you know, for religious purposes. So they acted very fast, and it was because they had started doing this surveillance and had deemed Buddhists, by very virtue of being Buddhists, as being anti-American. So I think we see a very long history of the way that religion has been racialized within the United States in terms of non-Christian, non-white religions being deemed anti-American. So we have one question from the audience that I think is adding on to what Dr. Avalos was saying about sort of the decrease in immigration on the southern border. So this question says, how can we understand the intense anti-immigration sentiments that have characterized modern politics, particularly the 2016 GOP platform, given the fact that illegal immigration rates and property/violent crime rates have been steadily decreasing?
It's almost like it's not about immigration, right? It's about whiteness, right? Dr. Avalos talked about the ways in which the proportion of white Americans is declining, right, theoretically, and that's the fear, right? This isn't about immigration, this isn't about property crime, right? This is about threats to whiteness.
Right.
And think about how big, you know, I'll just say one thing. If you are familiar with the literature, the American literature from the 1800s, Muslims, Arabs, Turks, and quote unquote Orientals loomed very, very large in American literature in the 1800s. And yet there were hardly any Muslims, Arabs, or Turks in the United States. Very few before 1870. I mean, you could count them on, I've actually looked at the census of 1850. I mean, I found like one guy from Arabia. I mean, so, you know, so they don't have to be there for you to make up fantasies about them and for them to be important to building your own identity. Sorry to interrupt there, Dr. Sophie.
Yeah, I would just add that, yeah, there is the threats don't have to be real, right, to be central in politics. But just that, this is so much about a demographic war, or like what is understood as a demographic war by a conservative, like especially the Republican Party today, in that we know demographically that it's around within 20 to 24 years that white Americans will be in the minority in the United States, and so what's happened is that the contemporary Republican Party has very much focused on, for a little while they were attempting to broaden their base, but that didn't. They've shifted over, the last like 5 years in particular, so that it's such an almost all white party that, in order to maintain their power, they have to choose not to, they have to choose to try to limit the populace in many ways, in terms of who can vote, who is here. And we can see this in terms of, the fact that the census is not being allowed to be completed. It stopped early in an attempt to try to undercount in cities where there are more, and undercount particularly undocumented immigrants, people of color, people in urban areas. So, it's very much about maintaining white power, but also through, I think this is really important, that the attempts to stop undocumented immigrants from coming into the United States, but also other forms of immigrants from coming into the United States, is a dual part of maintaining this smaller electorate, which also is part of these strategies of limiting access to voting, which we're seeing in so many places during this election in particular.
So I just like to add one thing, which is, the so-called crisis at the border. Those detention camps have a long genealogy, as Dr. McNichol notes, right, with Japanese internment, but really the original model was Native reservations. And so part of the whole logic, as Dr. Curtis notes, is containment. How do we contain the contagion? How do we contain the non-white other, right? And really the Native reservations were the model for Nazi concentration camps. And you also see the ways in which eugenics still plays out there. You can starve a people and beat a people, but you can also start to sterilize them. And that's what's happening in these detention camps. And that's what's happened historically to Black and brown women, women in Puerto Rico, poor women, right? And so this is a mechanism. It's really one of the mechanisms of settler colonialism to maintain white supremacy. But also it becomes, these detention camps become a place for racial capitalism to persist and to essentially commodify bodies in order to profit from those bodies, right? So people are making money off of detention. Detention is essentially become, right as soon as Donald Trump got sworn into office in 2017, private prison industry stocks shot up. Why? Because we knew ultimately those in power knew what was going to happen. And so racial capitalism and these logics of containment and contagion are all interlinking pieces of settler colonialism, which is really white Christian supremacy.
And whiteness is right, like whiteness is this made up thing, right? And it's like an amoeba, right? Like the other side of containment is assimilation, right? And whiteness will expand and take over everything around it, right up to the line, the black-white line, right? Like that's the assimilation line. And so if you cut off immigration, then you create an opportunity for the amoeba of whiteness to start taking over, right? And to sort of consume people who identified in prior times as of a specific nationality or ethnicity. So that's, I mean, that's part of the indigenous American story too, right? Is forced assimilation. That's part of the story of Catholicism in the 19th century among Italians, and it's part of the story of Catholicism and Judaism in the 20th century. And so that's, part of to the degree that there's a logic, right? Part of the logic of addressing immigration is that if you stop it, right, then there's this possibility for consuming the assimilable people here into this like whiteness amoeba, which is a really non-academic way to describe that process, but I think it works.
And I'll just add one quick, that you hurt people so bad in so many ways that if they can become white, they will become white. Because all those things that Dr. Avalos was talking about, and just as you've mentioned, Dr. Green, or do you go Collis Green? Sorry. Either one. We can't, I was, as Dr. Avalos was talking, I was having a moment because, these things are happening right now. This is not the past. And it just reminds me, I'm writing a history right now of Syrian Muslims in the Midwest before World War I. It is, and some of us here might have personal experience of this from different perspectives, but because this is gendered as well, whiteness is also gendered. It's not just a racialized. But they will hurt you so bad that sometimes you just, if you can pass, you're gonna try sometime. Some of you are gonna try sometime.
So I think this is probably a good time to start turning to white nationalism and religion in particular. So in the past 4 years, we've witnessed an increase in white and Christian nationalism in the public sphere particularly. So in 2017, the nation watched as self-identified white nationalists marched in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in response to the proposed removal of Confederate monuments. And recently we've seen a lot of Confederate monuments pulled down in Black Lives Matter protests. We've recently witnessed the spread of QAnon among white evangelicals and from sort of a fringe on the internet into kind of mainstream white evangelicalism. And in the first presidential debate, the President of the United States told the Proud Boys to, quote, stand back and stand by. So I'm wondering if we can maybe devote some time to talking about the larger history that's leading us to this resurgence of white nationalism and how white nationalism is being connected to religion here and why we should be connecting it to religion.
Yeah, so let me speak to that. It's a big, important question. There's always been, ever since the abolition of slavery, there's been an organized, white vigilante movement that's focused on defending white power. And so, if we look at historically, it's really like the abolition of slavery, the end of the Civil War, the KKK forms basically at the same time, and is very successful at helping to end Reconstruction, working outside of legal systems, but in line with them. And so, historically, we can look at each step towards actually achieving a multiracial democracy, there's a response, an organized white response, vigilante response. And so that movement has never gone away. In the 90s, they went online. They've been organizing online since then, and social media really allowed them to expand their movement. But I think what we are seeing is more of a shift in conservative whites from what we would say is implicit bias, right? Having racial bias, but not being wanting to be explicit about it or claiming that, to as their power is shifting into demographic power, as we were talking about earlier, the narrative of white Christian morality, Christian nationalism is being challenged, that there's more of this convergence I see between explicit racism and the conservative whiteness. So political scientist here at Vanderbilt, Larry Bartels, just had an article out that looked at survey data amongst white Republicans that show that what he calls ethnic antagonism, or fear of losing white power, is actually led to very significant kind of acceptance amongst white Republicans of authoritarianism, the acceptability of violence, and a significant decrease in democratic norms. And so, there's always been an organized white nationalist movement. As was just talked about, they're, the biggest terror threat that Americans face. More Americans have lost their lives to white nationalists over the last 20 years than to any other group. But what I think is also a very significant and deeply problematic trend is that these anti-democratic views are spreading amongst the broader right. And this was the goal of the alt-right, right? To say like, oh, the racist right is just part of the conservative movement. We're just like, it's like they're not a separate authoritarian, right, terrorist wing. They're just part of like the spectrum of political diversity. And unfortunately, I think that strategy has really been working, so that, a lot of white evangelicals are now accepting more anti-democratic beliefs as well.
So I'd like to add that, we can see white militias and white nationalist violence. We sometimes think of it as an outlier, or, what folks have been using this phrase, which I really appreciate. Instead of it being a bug in the system, it's a feature, right? We have to understand it as a feature of settler colonialism. And that really, the way that I teach about it and think about it is an expression of extra-legal violence, right? And the extra-legal violence is the law of the land. The extra-legal violence is what created the US, right? So the illegal squatting on Native people's lands, and then the justification of that squatting and dispossession of that land comes after the fact. The first act is always the extra-legal violence. And so we can think of things like lynching. Lynching was something that was almost normal in the middle 19th century up into the early 20th century. It started with Native peoples. It was then directed at African diaspora peoples, and also directed in particular during the Mexican-American War, but after, as Mexican and Native lands were taken over. It was particularly effective in places like Texas, and then places like California, where in California, for instance, you developed what was called squatters' rights. Well, squatters' rights were essentially enshrined into law, and it basically meant that white settlers could settle on the lands of Californios, those that had been deeded lands, and that their lands had been protected by the treaty after the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Hidalgo, but that this extra legal action was enshrined into law because this is essentially a feature of settler colonialism. It always needs to justify itself. And so extra legal violence has a role. It will always exist as settler colonialism will exist.
All right, if nobody has anything else to add to that, then I think we could, talk about the flip side to this, which is, looking at social justice and religion. So recently, we've been experiencing a kind of racial reckoning within the United States with, following the public killing of George Floyd on May 25th. We've seen a sort of national awakening sparking nationwide Black Lives Matter protests and conversations about the history of slavery and systemic racism in this country. So I'm wondering if you could all speak to, how this conversation isn't one that's just about race, but also one that is about religion. And then how do we see sort of religious conceptualizations of decolonization, resistance, and liberation?
I mean, I'll start and just say that in my own personal life and in my teaching, I'm always going back to and drawing wisdom and encouragement from religious figures from the civil rights movement in American history. Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin King, Malcolm X. These are individuals that I always turn to and who had at the center of their faith formation was the idea that everybody was made in the image of God, and that this was a really radical statement to say that people of color were made in the image of God, and that that was at the center of their activism. And so I get this question a lot in my own classroom. A lot of young adults are growing up in a moment where the civil rights movement is such a foreign thing, and the loudest voices in religion and politics seem to be voices that are advocating for shrinking the notion of who is made in the image of God. And so I'm always going back to these figures and reading them and encouraged by their actions and their faith, and how their faith gave them courage to stand for progressive causes and to stand for justice. And I think that that is one way that the history can do that for us. Now, I don't situate them as the answer to our current dilemma whatsoever, but I do think we can draw lessons from them, from these figures in the past, to encourage us in our own push for justice and equality in America today.
Yes, so one of my other hats is actually as a leftist religious activist. So I do believe in the potential of self-identifying religious people, at least, I mean, as one of my as the 75-year-old woman who directs a lot of my activism and has been arrested so many times, I mean, hundreds of times, interrupting, doing amazing things all over the world. I mean, she always tells me, I don't know whether I'll win, and I don't know whether we'll win. I just feel we can't control the outcome. We're just called to do the work. And I do, and I share that. I take off my, my analyst's hat, and I share that with students in particular because they actually don't meet many leftist Christians. And it has been, but if you study Africana religions, in not just US Black religions, but also the liberation theology of African Christians and African Muslims, the idea somehow that religion is necessarily oppressive, is one that just doesn't ring true for me ever since I was a little kid in Southern Illinois. When the message is that Brother Dr. Martin is saying that those were messages that cheered a weary traveler in rural Southern Illinois. And so I just, for me, I can't give up on that. And I understand how much religion has hurt other people. I acknowledge that. Obviously, I've been analyzing that this evening so far. But I do, and I want to keep, I think it's very important for people who self-identify as religious to keep very self-critical and accountable to multiple communities, especially those who have been injured by our religious traditions. But, and the only thing I'll say is that for me, I think in particular, it comes from the Black radical tradition in the United States. Is very important because it has always said that our liberation at home depends on the liberation of people outside the United States. And Malcolm X was in many ways a great theorist of that. And so for me, you can't just have liberation at home. It has to be abroad too, because white supremacy rests as much on the domination of foreign lands, especially, it always has, right? I mean, because what were native lands before they were incorporated into the US, right? So that it always has to be looking beyond our shores and not just inside our shores. And that's why for me, the liberal bargain that let's all, close ranks, support the war machine, and then we'll get equality afterwards has never worked throughout the 20th century.
I mean, I'll just add, I was in graduate school in a PhD program before I learned Christian socialists existed in the South ever. And I didn't know what to make of it because I didn't fit the experience that I had or the narratives that I had for the white South. And the reason white Christian socialists were not only present, but actually quite numerous in the South is because every generation of white Christians has had a few white Christians who stop to reflect on what has made white Christianity what it is, right? On the way in which, in whatever language that we have at a given time, on the way in which whiteness has constituted Christianity in this country, and the way in which Christianity in this country might look different. And the whiteness part and the capitalism part, as Dr. Martin has said earlier, are always inseparable, right? So these Christian socialists, they sat and they listened to people who were not themselves. They traveled around the world. They learned from other people. They didn't like tick off their religions in boxes. They made a ton of mistakes, right? They didn't listen long enough and they stopped listening and then they started taking charge because it's like an irresistible urge of the amoeba, right? But they provided an alternative path, right, for Christianity. They followed the alternative path that non-white Christians had long shaped. And they did it without just sort of navel gazing and reading lots of books about whiteness, which we need to do, right? But then turning that to reflect on the world that they lived in and to think about what they then needed to do in partnership with people who had been doing that work for a long time. So that has never been the dominant narrative in this country. But it has always been a possible narrative in this country.
So something that I find really inspiring about the Black Lives Matter movement was that its initiators, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, they've articulated a religious narrative that's actually actively catalyzing its center, right? And that it's a complex religious narrative. It's one that makes nods to the kind of church-centered, Black church-centered context of the civil rights, but also the reclamation of African diaspora religion that I think in contemporary Black American experience has created an intersection of, we could call it kind of decolonial renaissance, right? And so what I find fascinating about that movement is that it allows us to think about the genealogy, and something that Dr. Curtis noted is this kind of internationalism that decolonial movements denote, right? And, initially I was thinking in terms of, well, those decolonial movements can be linked back to like mid 20th century, even early 20th century movements of independence in Africa, South Asia, other parts of the world. But really thinking about how African slave revolts were also inspired by the liberation of Haiti and the independence of Haiti, and how there's a larger link historically between African peoples, because I think those of us in the US lose track of the fact that among the African diaspora that was essentially trafficked into the New World, a larger number was sent into Latin America, the Caribbean and South America. And so those movements of independence taking place there in the 1800s were always in conversation with African American communities in the US. And so we can see a very long, complex genealogy that speaks to really a pretty profound indictment of colonization, settler colonialism. But something that I've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement in this last year is the way in which both its indictment of African slavery then dovetailed into an indictment of colonialism more generally. So you have the toppling of these white nationalist figures in the South, but also Columbus statues through the US, statues of Father Sarah throughout California. Father Sarah was essentially the organizer, the one that instituted the mission system in California in the 1700s. So this larger insurgency or insurrection we're seeing is I see it as an intersectional struggle of Black and brown people to essentially fight against settler colonialism and come up with bottom-up solutions, alternatives, lateral relations of power for us to learn from and build upon.
Yeah, so I see there's questions from the audience, but I want us to be able to talk to, the current coronavirus pandemic, and then, we have time to overflow past 5:30 to answer these questions. So I wanted to ask you all, about the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on life in the United States and around the globe. At the moment we have 216,000 deaths in the United States from the virus, and the pandemic has really exposed the inequalities and injustices of our social system. And we've seen that Black, Latinx, and Indigenous Americans have been hit particularly hard, disproportionately hard by the virus. And we're currently facing, the largest economic recession since the Great Depression. And we've also seen sort of a larger, crisis of authority in terms of, denying COVID-19. So I was wondering how you all see different religious groups responding to the virus. And then I'm going to have a follow-up question for Dr. Green, because she wrote about the Great Depression in her book, so I want us to be able to take advantage of that.
I saw a poll that said that a study, the scholars who did the study on Christian nationalism and the recent book, and I think it's called Taking America Back for God. And they found in their study that folks who had Christian nationalist commitments were more likely to oppose wearing masks, social distancing, and some of the guidelines we've received from the CDC and others, health professionals, about how to stem the spread of the virus. And it's fascinating to me, but it makes sense in the sense of that if your faith is tied up in with ideas of the American tradition of conservatism about individualism, anti-statism, and commitments to laissez-faire capitalism and traditionalism, it makes sense to me. But then when I think, and I don't mean this to be, I did go to divinity school, so I know a little bit about the Bible. And it strikes me as interesting when you think about someone like Jesus, who's telling his followers to love thy neighbor as yourself. And it seems to me that wearing a mask is one of the most simple ways to show love of neighbor. You wear a mask as a way to protect your neighbor from the fact that perhaps that you may have had the virus. But it just goes to show the way that a Christian nationalist strain can really just transform that kind of message in a way that it makes complete sense for folks who say, I'm a Christian, I'm an American, therefore I am not wearing a mask, or therefore I'm not going to social distance. Or how dare you tell me that we can't have worship service, right? Who cares what the CDC says? And it's fascinating. I think it shows the way in which a Christian nationalist framework can really transform Jesus into an American. And I think the best way that we saw that is in Vice President Mike Pence, when he gave a speech at the Republican National Convention, when he took the words of scripture, took out Jesus and inserted Old Glory and inserted the American flag. And I think that's the quintessential example of the way that religion is framing one side of the debate along the lines of the COVID virus.
Yeah, here in Nashville last weekend, we had, it's estimated between 9,000 and 10,000 people at a Christian event gathered together to sing as a concert, but also, as against oppressing the church, right? It was very much in this response to, let's sing together because there's been this unfair oppression of the church because churches have been super spreader spaces, right? They've been linked to significant outbreaks. So that's very true. For me, I also think we really have to talk about abortion. Right now, right, the news is entirely dominated by the Supreme Court hearings and Coney Barrett. And, the Congress really had a choice to focus on passing passing legislation to provide assistance to people suffering from the economic fallout of the pandemic, or to try to push forward on this Supreme Court nominee. So despite the fact that the evidence is clear that due to our current economic crisis, it's like the statistics are appalling. It's around 1 in 4 American children right now are experiencing food insecurity, right? And that's like higher in Black and brown communities. That is not enough of a crisis, right, to get the Congress to really focus on addressing that problem, partly because abortion for white evangelicals and white Catholics has become the primary center of ethical life. The way that ethical life and politics converge is around defending, around opposing access to abortion. And so I don't think we can understand the pushing forward of the current Supreme Court nominee outside of that. And I think what's really important is to look at the way that through only focusing on abortion as the center of ethical life and the main political priority, it means that all other forms of suffering can be like kind of cut out of the political conversation, like not even addressed. And I think that's, we're seeing that playing out right now.
So what I found really fascinating is, in terms of religious response, is that almost immediately there was the creation of what we now understand in Indian country as quarantine dance specials. So on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, there were these virtual powwows or virtual spaces where people were sharing their powwow dancing, but in particular, jingle dance. Jingle dancers were centered. And I didn't know this until quarantine, but the jingle dance, this is a dance where you'll see it's specific to women, and it was really a medicinal dance that came out of the Ojibwe tribal nation during the last pandemic. And it's characterized by the regalia is covered by these tiny bells. And so when jingle dancers are dancing, they're understood to essentially be in ritual and prayer, seeking healing. And that this, a lot of people may not realize this, but Native American religious traditions are revelation-based. So often ceremonies are presented to tribes in particular moments of crisis. So during the last pandemic, it basically was divined by someone in the medicine person in the Ojibwe community, and was given to a young woman who was in need of it, was dying of the Spanish flu, and it became a popular dance among Native peoples, especially during the powwow circuit. So you see in these dance specials, I've been following them, and they started right up in like mid-late March, and they've been happening, and there's thousands of people following these Native dancers. And really part of the point and the whole goal is to bring medicine not only to individual Native tribes, but really for all people.
And so I wanted to ask Dr. Green, because Dr. Green's first book discusses Protestant establishment responses to the Great Depression and the creation of the New Deal, as well as she concludes the book with sort of a brief recap of the history of politics of welfare and social support. So Dr. Green, I was wondering if you could provide us with some of the historical background for the economic context of the pandemic and its impact on religious groups. What are we seeing in terms of responses that are different from prior economic recessions? And are we seeing any sort of continuities that have led us to the present day in terms of responses economically?
This is a setup for a very long answer, but I bet at least some of y'all, I guess y'all can eat because you don't have to be on here, but I'm going to try to keep it short so we can all eat. So, let me start with this. Capitalism relies on a narrative of infinite supply and exploitation of resources on the one hand, and especially in this country, a narrative of scarce distribution on the other, right? So there's always enough if you're like going mining, but there's never enough if you're talking about what I can have versus what you can have. So I want to say that, and then I want to set that aside and talk for a minute about the historical part of this. And it's a sort of a tricky question because the Great Depression is a different moment from this one. The first 2 years of the Great Depression, Americans had a president who kept saying, "This is like everything's fine, it's totally fine. We're gonna be out of this in a minute." It's not really a depression. It's already over. And that lasted for 2 years while people were hungry and people were dying of hunger. And then white people started dying of hunger and then in a way that was noticeable and visible, right? And so I hesitate ever to say that a crisis, especially an economic crisis, like creates this opportunity for change. But what it did do in the absence of a response or a viable response was that there were these 2 years where there was no response and people were struggling and they were trying to make sense of it. And what you got from the Protestant establishment, from the churches, and in many cases was like, oh, it's a spiritual crisis, right? Like that's always a narrative of a crisis. Okay, well, we just got to get people back in church and then we're good. There's this guy, Roger Babson, this economist, who did a whole map of like, oh, well, thank goodness it's a recession or a depression because now we're going to have a revival, right? Like every depression leads to a revival. So there's like this joy at this suffering. But what happens during these 2 years of that actual suffering is that joy, that revival doesn't happen, and the joy dies. And people start to think about themselves as part of a collective and start to think in terms of a public good. And briefly, in the absence of a federal response, began to demand one, began to say that, wow, look, there should be enough here for everyone. And for a minute, people said there's enough for everyone, right? And so you get, this is like a real big gloss on the history, but like I said, we all got to eat. So you get this response from Franklin Roosevelt, who is elected for this response, right? Which is, oh, like there's enough. We're gonna make jobs and we're gonna distribute food. And actually, it was a very limited response if you look at it from the 21st century perspective, right? Like the food distribution doesn't happen for very long. There's no actual distribution of funds beyond a very limited and quickly ended program. But the logic behind it is, we are a public, we serve the public good. There's enough for everyone. And then like the response and the Protestant establishment, by the way, sort of across the board, across political lines, is on board with this because the people in their churches are hungry and they're sick. And they say, oh, this is what we've been talking about. This is the on the achievement of the social gospel, or like, this is what the Bible tells us to do across the spectrum. And then when things get better, which they did, there's this pause, especially on the part of white Southerners and white men, which is like, oh wait, everyone? I'm not so sure about that, right? And the New Deal never actually served everyone. There were always limits to New Deal programs. There were always limits to that logic, and it varies a lot by program. It's hard to describe which, like some programs were always really white supremacist in their in their design, and some were less so. But the logic was that we can serve everyone. So you jump ahead, right? This happens again in 2007-2008 recession. And once again, you have the lack of a response, a demand for a president who will respond, who will mount a federal response. And it's not unanimous, but it's pretty widespread. And you get a response, right? You get the bank bailout, some consumer protection, and you get the Affordable Care Act, which is once again on the chopping block in the moment when, for all of its problems, people need it the most, right? But what happens, and what's different about the 2008 response and what's different about the response now, is that there's this logic of scarcity that takes hold, right? If there's enough for everyone, if there's really enough for everyone, then how am I special? And if you're capital, right, and capital grows and capital gains power, and if you're capital and there's enough for everyone, then you can't pit people against each other, right? Like you can't pit poor white people against poor black people because they don't have to fight, right? There's enough. And so the economic logic, briefly, right, actually cut into the identity logic. And that was a place where Christians and Protestants actually didn't fall across political lines in terms of the commitment to the economic logic. And that's what's changed. There's been an attack on the notion of the public, on the notion of the public good, and on the notion of plenty, right, that comes from the right, because that's how you split us, that's how you divide us. So, you know, there's enough for huge tax breaks, but there isn't enough for a Green New Deal, right? Because there's enough for me, but there's not enough for everybody. And so that's where I would say that the logic has changed, and that's where you see the, you know, theology can shape culture, but theology can also follow culture. And that's where you see theology following culture. And to some degree shaping it too. You see the sort of co-constitution of these white supremacist economic ideas with white theologies. It was a little long, but I'm gonna stop now.
I was gonna say you might deserve an award for doing all of that in that amount of time. That was impressive. So I want to, because I know that some students probably have to leave and like eat food. So we have two questions that I think we can combine into one question. The first one asks about the emancipatory potential of religion in contemporary United States, and particularly Christianity, given, you know, this history of white supremacism and violence that we have been talking about. And the second one asks how a conservative, white, devout Christian, but one who condemns white supremacy, might fit into this narrative without sacrificing their values and without offending any minorities that they're looking to support.
Well, there are ways to be evangelical, and which traditionally, as I understand it, is indeed defined in terms of an exclusivism. That is, that the sole way to get to heaven is to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, and to be compassionate and to share resources. And let's maybe the panel can come up with some of your favorite readings. I won't give a sermon. I think that would be better for me not to give a sermon on this. But instead, I mean, first of all, think about in the Second Great Awakening how so many of the reform movements were fueled by evangelicals: anti-slavery, temperance, physical education, anti-tobacco, you know, all kinds of, you know, so many social reform movements were fueled by evangelical Christians. And then, of course, as Dr. Martin has pointed out, many of the movers and shakers in the civil rights movement were also conservative evangelical Christians. So it is possible, at least you have, whoever asked the question, you have enormous examples, if you happen to be American, of this history. And this is, I think, the largest Protestant country on the face of the earth, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of population. So you've got that, but who else? Contemporary evangelicals who maintain that their socially conservative values actually make them disagree with a lot of the current policies of the current administration might include, help me out folks, Tony Campolo, Jim Wallace, who else?
Yeah, I would also just add, also because we haven't mentioned it, that climate change is very much on the table and very much related to religion. There's like the group Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, which are a multiracial group of evangelicals fighting for climate change, but also other social justice issues. And yeah, there's no reason why white Christians are synonymous with white supremacy, that's very much a choice. And to challenge white supremacy, it's very much about educating oneself and, seeing who one is in relationships with, right? And learning from.
So I would say that what would be ideal is a real mobilization of a Christian left, and a Christian left that isn't necessarily like a liberal left, that doesn't traffic in the kind of politics of representation that are still invested in empire, but instead a kind of radical left that seeks to really redefine what power and our social world looks like here in the US. And, I really appreciate the environment being raised, because I think what I found so fascinating about Standing Rock is that there were all these, there was an interfaith space built there, right? And that interfaith space is also invested in environmental justice, but I think they had been reluctant, some of these representatives had been reluctant to do the deeper work of indicting racism and settler colonialism and really racial capitalism as the culprits behind environmental crisis. And that if we really want to deal with environmental crisis, we're going to have to address all those issues head on. And I think that it could take a real radical movement on the left that is interfaith, but it could definitely be Christian, from my understanding of, not only the kind of Catholic workers history, that community, but also liberation theology folks. I think that many of them are doing that work now, and we just have to see a more salient mobilization.
Yeah, and I would just add to that with the Catholicism, to the student who asked the question, is not to be afraid to check out some Catholic historical figures like Dorothy Day, that was named, the Berrigan brothers, who were priests, Father James Grappi out of Milwaukee, who was a civil rights activist. These individuals also very much so believed that Jesus was the way to salvation, and that compelled them and propelled them to engage in activism to make the world a better place for people of color and people who were the poor and the marginalized. And so there might be some Catholic sources that you could consult as well, as was already mentioned by Ed, liberation theology in Latin America and other places as well. So evangelical Christians have been very open and accepting of Catholics, particularly along the lines of abortion, as Dr. James mentioned earlier. I think that we could also look to some Catholic sources for those who are seeking to be more on the progressive side as well in their faith commitments.
All right, to conclude, and if anybody has questions, now is the time to be putting them in the Q&A box. But to conclude, I was hoping that you could all very briefly just say what you think the future of religion in the United States is, kind of looking forward to, beyond the election.
I try to hide behind the hat to say that I'm a historian and I don't predict the future to let myself off the hook on these sorts of questions. But I'll just simply say that history tells us that unless something changes, I think we'll see another Donald Trump will rise and white evangelicals will support him unless something seriously changes about the feature within white evangelical conservative politics. Unless something changes in that feature, not the bug, but the feature, we'll see another. But on the other side of the political spectrum, I'm excited about the Poor People's Campaign, what's come out of Reverend William Barber and others who have gotten together, who are trying to mobilize around these questions, around the poor and the marginalized. And I think we'll continue to see that. And I think with the Poor People's Campaign, Young Evangelicals for Climate Change, I think we'll see a lot of younger folks, get involved in religious movements for social justice. And I think that white evangelicals may find themselves in a slight crisis as it relates to younger adults. But unless something changes, as this feature that is in white evangelical religion, I suspect that we'll see another President Trump politician, whether nationally or locally, rise up and receive a great deal of support.
Historians are not peddlers of hope, as a sort of trope in our field, right? And I'm not either, but I do want to say, as a person who's 0% optimistic, that the other thing about history, though, is that it's full of unintended consequences, and no story is written till it's done. And if I had to predict the future, it probably wouldn't be super hopeful, but I don't have to, right? And I can't, because these movements that Dr. Martin is talking about, that Dr. Curtis has talked about, that everyone in this panel is in some way involved in, right? They have so much potential and so much power. And the thing about capitalism is that it wants you as a system to make you think it's the only option, that there is nothing else. And it's not the only option. And there is something else. And we just have to imagine it. And we have to imagine it together. And we have to imagine a world in which there's enough and we're enough, right? And that sounds like the most idealistic thing I've ever said, but it's happened before. And part of the reason we're stuck where we are is because of the reaction to activists fighting really hard. And activists have to keep fighting really hard and growing our ranks and speaking up. And I guess I don't want to predict the future because I'm bad at it and it wouldn't be optimistic, but I do want to imagine the future that we could make for ourselves if we dared.
So I am actually very hopeful, partly because as Dr. Green notes, this kind of rise in white Christian nationalism is a response to major social changes that have been taking place for decades. And so I think we've been winning and that we still are winning. I describe the outcome of the last election to my students as the death rattle of white supremacy. It's one final surge in desperate attempts to retain power, because not only has the narrative, but the motivations are, the narrative is way beyond its purview and control, but the motivations of others to bring it back to Standing Rock, the kind of mobilization that was happening there, mutual aid and sense of mutuality. What I find so powerful about teaching indigenous religious traditions and really teaching non-Christian traditions in general is that you can help emphasize for students that this conceptualization of self as individual is somewhat unique to a Christian European worldview, right? And that even in the last like 10, 15, 20 years, whether it's the Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street movement, subsequent land-based stewardship movements, now really, I think, global indigenous movements around protection of lands, it mobilized lots of religious communities, especially Buddhists. American Buddhists showed up there, and they've been showing up. The anti-racism discourse there and the environmental justice discourse there is really profound. And so we're seeing the possibility of intervention happening on the level of worldview, really. That there are, not only is another world possible, but multiple worldviews are coexisting here. And they are overriding and negating and in some ways challenging a deeply individualist, deeply racist worldview that has expired and that we're really seeing the last of.
Yeah, thank you. And Adina, I just want to say thank you to you and like you're such great questions, and thanks for bringing us all together. What a hard question, and it's such a interesting one to think of. I mean, I am an ethnographer. I don't know if we're probably more likely to project the future, but not necessarily more likely to be better at the projections. But I've attended religious right conferences for almost 15 years now as part of my research, and the kind of discussion of younger evangelicals is becoming increasingly frenetic and anxiety provoked in those spaces, because they know young evangelicals are leaving Christianity altogether or becoming indoctrinated in what they describe as social justice, which is what the religious right often frames as a problematic understanding of Christianity. So that trend is going to continue. I have had many older evangelicals explain that, it's a generational thing, that when the young evangelicals become middle-aged, they'll become conservative and move far to the right like their parents. So that's also a possibility in terms of, we're talking about, especially the amoeba-like qualities of whiteness, right? That it tends to, as white folks grow and become middle-aged and want to maintain their power, right, kind of become more conservative and can move more to the right. But I think what's happening is that really it is a crisis. We are in a conflict of worldviews, and what there is around conservative white Christian worldviews is a denial of reality in many ways. The white evangelicals in particular are the most likely to deny the reality of anthropogenic climate change, right? That the denial of the pandemic is an extension of that, right? And it shows the way that, very basic facts can become politicized. I mean, the people that I study, they're not going to say, God doesn't care if, God will protect me from eating hamburgers all day and smoking cigarettes because, he's on my side. They're going to listen to nutritional science, right, about taking care of their health. But when it comes to wearing a mask, suddenly that's in this other realm, right, where I've heard many times evangelicals say, well, God's protecting me, I don't need to wear a mask, which is showing the way that this worldview is very much based in a denial of certain kinds of reality. But I mean, what I see is that over the next decade, the impacts of climate change are going to be increasingly problematic. And so, I think from that it points to a few different possibilities, right? That there becomes more of a kind of compassionate recognition of the need to share resources, to challenge the dominance of capitalism and the, myth of unending resources, or unfortunately, an increase in fascism. you know, that with increasing numbers of climate refugees and a commitment to like maintain, you know, control over limiting smaller and smaller amounts of resources in terms of access to water, clean water, you know, in environments that are not apocalyptic. And I think that really it does come down to social movements, you know, like has already been addressed, that, you know, the crisis is going to continue, and that creates an opportunity to kind of challenge some of these dominant narratives about white supremacy and racial capitalism. But there also really needs to be an effort, and particularly, I will second this, that from a Christian left kind of leading this call to kind of reframe. It's not to say that Christianity is bad, right? To say that white supremacist Christianity is bad. And like that criticism really is going to be stronger if it's coming from within the Christian community.
So I was reading today some data about the largest number ever of 20-year-olds say that they don't have a religion, at least what they're telling pollsters. It's almost 50% now, half. And it's just a decade. I mean, we're talking about a very large increase. Many of my students in my classroom in Indianapolis have no religious background whatsoever. They come to my class not knowing any books of the Bible, for example, if they happen to be from a Jewish or a Christian background, but that background wasn't. And so when we talk about the fate of religion in the future, one of the things I think we have to prepare for as teachers and as citizens is, first of all, how do we teach religion in a country that is becoming more and more, and I think we're reaching, to me, I mean, if I had to guess, we're close to a tipping point now, and where, you know, I can tell you in my school we polled people, only 30% of people at the School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI identify as religious in any way, shape, or form. So, you know, so when we think about religion in the future, we have to say, how do we as teachers reach students who don't look to the authority of quote unquote world religions, of colonially configured religions, as their source of ethics, as their source of beauty, as their source of justice, of pleasure, of meaning. And so our role in part as teachers about religion is to help to create an environment in which we catalyze social change and human life around the idea that there is people who have no religion. Now, we have a lot of categories in religious studies that we can use to study anything, any part of culture. We've always been, since the 1960s, through comparative religion, we can apply our categories to all kinds of commitments and aesthetics and rituals, etc. But in terms of our own ethical obligations, you know, that's what, as teachers, that's what I'd say, you know, I'm thinking about how do I get the change I want when I really, you know, there's not going to be as large a number of Christians or Muslims or Jews, you know, maybe more Muslims, you know, but we're only talking 1% there. So that's my first question. And if that's so, I mean, as I think about the future, I actually think that the ethical way to think about the future is thinking about values of love and care and compassion and justice, and how I have to be individualistic actually on this. I have to take responsibility for myself, and I say, well, I can't control, I can't control the future. And yes, it can turn on a dime, I know that. But all I can do all I can do is what Dr. Green said. I mean, I have an ethical obligation, I think, to imagine the future, and to do one to imagine a future that embodies my deepest values of a world of diversity, including a world of people without formal religious affiliation.
All right, I just want to thank all of our, yeah.
I just wanted to say to everybody, then I appreciate your comments. Please pray for me, help my unbelief that I can be a little more hopeful like the rest of you all. I'm just kidding, kind of. Thank you for having me. But thanks for everyone. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to share their expertise with us for what has been such a great and rich conversation. And to, again, thank our co-sponsors, the Religious Studies Department and Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities, and then all of you who stuck around to the end, even though we went way over time. We really appreciate it. And so I just want to say thank you, everybody.
Thank you.